Hi, everyone. Welcome to this special bonus mashup of Myers-Briggs and Enneagram for the Enneagram Roadmap. We're here with Dr. Beatrice Chestnut. I'm Joel Mark Witt with Antonia Dodge as well. And we're going to basically take your questions about the Enneagram system, the Myers-Briggs system, and how maybe these two things cross over and match up together, and some of the questions you might have on how the two systems overlay. So we want to get into some of the questions we have today. We have a lot of people online right now, and we're going to get to as many questions as possible in the next, hour and a half, 90 minutes-ish. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible and answer them for you.
Well, I do want to make a note that Beatrice and I still don't feel 100% comfortable in the other person's lane. Beatrice is still the master of Enneagram and subtypes. And Joel and I will both be handling the Myers-Briggs questions primarily. We are getting a much more rich idea of how these two systems mash up. But I think it's the most powerful when you ask questions about challenges you might be dealing with or things that you believe in your life are being impacted or affected by both your Enneagram and your Myers-Briggs type. And so we will do a one-to-one on the fielding of those. If you have a lot of conceptual questions about how the systems mash up together, we have some growing knowledge around that, and we might be able to help you. But some of the intricacies we're still working out ourselves. And so this is a more complex thing than I think people in the past have wanted it to be. It doesn't seem like there's any one-to-one correlations on much of anything. So we're still figuring it out ourselves.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think the point of this is to use this understanding for personal growth, to grow yourself as a person, to become a better version of yourself. So everything that we like to talk about at Personality Hacker is through the framework of how do you take action on this? How can you actually apply the things we talk about to your life? So if you bring application questions, maybe a challenge you're having, that's a really great access point for you and us to do some workshopping around how the two systems can help you in your life. So we could frame it that way. That'd be an excellent way to go. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think that's really, it's going to be more beneficial than just theoretical questions. They're interesting and exciting, but one of the best places to start is with the practical, and then we can draw the theoretical from that.
Exactly.
So let's go ahead and jump into some of the questions we had emailed in. Do you want to do that
Well,
first?
actually, I'm going to give a little bit of precedence to people who are live.
Yeah, if anybody has a live one, that's great.
And conveniently, the first person is somebody who also emailed in. So we get to kill two birds with one stone.
Awesome.
Kathy says, INTJ self-pres 5. I have a question about other people's Enneagram types, especially close family. How other people's Enneagram types, especially close family, influence ours. From reading the complete Enneagram, I gather that our type depends highly on our childhood environments and our unmet needs during that time. Excuse me. But our Myers-Briggs types are hardwired. Family influences our behaviors and might make it hard to identify our Myers-Briggs type, but the cognitive function stack is what's useful for growth. How does family influence our Enneagram type, and should that be pushed aside to help us determine our type or growth path? For example, I'm an INTJ self-pres 5 that grew up with an emotional ESFJ type 4 mom and ESFP sibling. I struggle to determine whether I'm a 5 or a 1, but wonder if all that emotion influenced my behavior. I have behaviors of both 5 and 1, but I resonate more with the information around 5s. All right, so what I'm getting from this, and let me know if I'm hitting the nail on the head, this is primarily about how if Enneagram types are manifest through the influences of our family members, how much so? And is it possible that her Enneagram type is different than what she's resonating with because of the influences of the emotional people in her family? So do you want to take the first part of that?
Sure. First of all, I thank her for this question. So I think she's pointing to something that I was not clear enough on in the complete Enneagram, which is I do also believe that our types are hardwired. I believe it's both, interestingly. I believe both we come in with our type and subtype, but that often you can usually point to your childhood and see, of course, how your childhood environment influenced you heavily. So I think it's both. I do think that there are certain ways your environment influences you specifically, but I won't go into that now. What I'll just say to get right to the point is I definitely think your family members and especially your parents influence how your type shows up Now, it is a little bit interesting if you have a type 4 mother and you're a 5. I would look for ways where you maybe reacted against somebody bringing a lot of emotion toward you. Sometimes 5s can, you may on the one hand have a little bit more tolerance or access to emotions if your parent was because just for people to be clear, 5s are probably the type of all 9 types that are the least connected to emotion, and 4s are the type that's the most connected to emotion. So that's an interesting mix. And I would say if you're a 5 and if you're a self-preservation 5, that's the 5 that's of the 3 5s, the one, well, social 5s and self-preservation 5s can both be, they just automatically detach from emotion. And part of their coping strategy is to kind of avoid emotional entanglements and avoid having to deal with other people's emotions. So if you're a 5 and you had a 4 mother, that's an interesting story I'd want to know more about to say too much about it. But I will say that you could be someone who sort of learned that you needed to protect yourself against a lot of emotion coming toward you from the outside world, which the self-preservation 5 is all about that. Now, if that's not exactly the dynamic, then you might want to look more at 1, because 1 and 5 can be lookalikes in the Enneagram. But I would definitely say absolutely the parents of your types, I think of it as a parental overlay. For instance, sometimes I once worked with a woman who was a 3, but she kept testing as an 8, and a lot of people experienced her as an 8. Turns out her father was an 8, and she had been close to him, and she had been a competitive athlete, and he had kind of coached her a lot. So there was a way that she was kind of 8-ish. Now, she wasn't an 8, but that parental relationship gave her kind of more of a flavoring of 8, because in her life, she had to interact with that person. So maybe more than most 3s, she developed a kind of 8-ishness about her because that was just a big influence in her life. So I'll stop there and let you guys say what you think.
Well, I think it's interesting that you say that 5s and 1s can be lookalikes. Is that particularly with self-pres 5s, or is it just with all the 5s?
Well, I think that of the 1s, the social one is the one that most looks like a 5 because it's the most intellectual. Mm-hmm. And it also is a 5 that, interestingly, it's a little bit counterintuitive than what you would think of with the social subtype, but they actually feel a little bit outside the group and they feel more comfortable being alone. My brother is a social 1, for instance, and he often asks me, "Are you sure I'm not a 5? Because it's just kind of the way that particular one presents. Mm-hmm. I just do think they have a lot of things in common in terms of sort of a certain kind of competency, a certain kind of logical way of thinking, rational, process-oriented, and to some degree. So there are just a lot of similarities, although there are also, of course, some differences.
So as an INTJ, there's a lot of crossover between the INTJ description and the Enneagram 5 description, particularly in the concept of avarice. That 5s, the idea that 5s are, I'll let you speak to how this shows up in 5s, but the avaricious nature of the 5 can be reflected in INTJs always feeling like they don't have enough energy. INTJs are almost always trying to very carefully met out their energy at any given time.
Very vigilant about it.
Mm-hmm,
and that's very, very 5-ish.
Mm-hmm, exactly. And so I think a lot of INTJs, even if they aren't 5s, sometimes initially believe they're 5s because there's a crossover in description around that.
Yeah.
But, and I would say on a scale that trends, INTJs trend toward being Enneagram 5s. They don't have to be, but it's a trend. But I've also noticed that they trend toward being 1s as well. And if you look at the cognitive function stack or the CAR model, one of the reasons why that also suits an INTJ is the 10-year-old or tertiary function of introverted feeling or authenticity. Because it's a function that is very focused on being, on questions of what's good and bad and right and wrong, and wanting to be a good person and wanting to see oneself as a good person. There can be sort of a black and white element to having that function in the 10-year-old or tertiary position because it's more childlike. And the more childlike something is, the less nuance a person is likely to see. And so there's a little bit of a sort of a black and white, this is right, this is wrong feel that an INTJ can have if they are particularly focused or concerned about that, which looks a little one-ish. The preoccupation with being good and bad, the preoccupation with being a good person can also look like an INTJ's preoccupation with their 10-year-old or tertiary function. But I think what it comes down to is which of those Enneagram, what is the one's equivalent to the avarice? I can't remember the word.
Anger.
Anger. Oh, it is anger. Okay.
Yes.
And you can talk a little bit about how that can show up. But I think if the only thing that is matching the description between INTJs and 5 is that feeling of like always feeling like you're not ready, always feeling like you have to explore more or learn more before you can enter the world, the sense of like wanting to protect your energy. If that piece is just like, it's almost like you double up on it. If you're both an INTJ and a 5, it's like, that's your story. That is the story because you're doubling up on it in both systems. And so that is going to be, sort of the major theme of your life. If you're a 1 in an INTJ, the theme is going to change a little bit. It's going to be more about the unknown component of the sort of that stoic right, wrong, needing to be very preoccupied with whether or not you're a good person and trying to make sure that everything you're doing is the right thing to do, which is a little different than that doubling up of that theme. It's going to have a little bit more of a fleshed out like wing of, maybe I shouldn't use the word wing when I'm talking about Enneagrams, but it's going to, I can't do that with the Enneagram. I can't use the same language that I would with Myers-Briggs. It's going to have kind of a bit of like a little bit of a spice to it, as opposed to simply doubling up on that one component that's common to both INTJs and 5s. Does that make sense, by the way, to you, Beatrice?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm almost picturing different Venn diagrams, like if there's a circle that's the INTJ, part of the 5 will sort of overlap with part of it, but the 1 might overlap with another part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so what would be like if anger is the one is that corollary for 1s, what can that show up as? What does that look like?
Well, in 1s, anger tends to be repressed or held back. So most 1s, some 1s think like it's not okay to be angry, and they're more preoccupied with like doing things right and acting in appropriate ways and following the rules, or they're concerned with their impact on others. And so they'll tend to hold back their anger, but then it leaks out as irritation or resentment. So a lot of 1s will say they don't really relate to being angry, but they do relate to being resentful, sometimes self-righteous. So the 1-to-1 one or the sexual one is really the only one that's more openly angry. The other 2 ones tend to repress it, so it kind of turns into something else. Like the self-preservation one can be more of a warm, friendly person, a little more anxious, and the social one tends to be a one that, again, is more intellectual, that is more cool and removed and sort of being the model or the teacher of how other people should do things because they know the right way to do it.
Right. Whereas I would say that an INTJ that's a 5 would probably more likely have themes around needing more bravery, like wanting to be more brave, wanting to be more
assertive. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Self-pres 5s. Self-pres 5s are the least angry or the least outwardly angry. They don't really express as much as the other 5s. They tend to be a little more contained, and they don't really express aggression very much. So I would say one question, if you're trying to decide if you're a 5 or a 1, would be, do I have some underlying irritation and resentment and anger, or if I have some of that, is it not really a prominent feature?
What's nice is that the growth path for INTJs is actually kind of similar in both 1s and 5s, interestingly enough.
Yeah.
Because, and we just did a mentorship group. In fact, we complete it tomorrow with INTJs. And one thing we saw over and over and over again was a tendency to not feel emotionally, like having enough emotional energy to address a bunch of emotions that need processing. And so we, like the illustration we kept using over and over was like putting it in a box and kicking it under the bed. And then having all of this, like it creates this energetic leak, where all of these emotions that haven't been processed are just sitting there waiting and sort of churning and waiting for attention. And then they just that can get kicked down the road, and it creates all of these emotional drains and leaks. And so for INTJs, one of the best things an INTJ can do for growth is to give themselves some space to start addressing their emotions and figuring out healthy ways to process it. And I would imagine that if an INTJ does that, they're going to get more in touch whatever that core emotion is, whatever is the thing that they see popping up for them more and more and more, or more often, which will probably also help diagnose whether or not they're more of a 1 or a 5. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and for the 5, they're a fear type. So although again, 5s aren't always in touch with fear, or deeper down, fear is more the issue than anger. Whereas for 1, they're also part of the anger triad, in addition to having anger as their passion. Right. So they're more about anger at a certain point. The tricky part would be if you're a self-preservation 1, you're going to be a little more anxious, a little more fearful. So you might have some of both, whereas the self-preservation 5 probably isn't connected that much on an ongoing way to either, although deeper down it'll be more about fear, and especially, like you said, fear about getting depleted, or fear about getting entangled in other people's emotional stuff, right? Which I think is one of the most interesting things if this person is really a self-preservation 5, about having a 4 mother. Because there may be a very interesting dynamic that you could learn a lot about for your growth path around what happened there with how did you respond to your mother's emotionality? Did it actually make you more tolerant and more emotional than an average 5? Or was it part of why, as a self-pres 5, you kind of wanted to go inside your head and not come out?
All right. Well, then maybe the introverted feeling work of an INTJ won't be helpful until you really dig in there, because apparently there's a lot of crossover nuance between the emotions of 1s and 5s. But if you get in there, there's probably an ability to do a better diagnostic with what is sort of the core emotion that you're coming with. And one of the questions that she mentioned, I do want to highlight, is how does family influence our Enneagram type, and should that be pushed aside to help us determine our type or a growth path? And it sounds like no. It sounds like that's all part of an ecosystem.
I think you take it into account. I mean, normally family influence doesn't it doesn't get so much in the way. Like, I wouldn't take that into account too much when you're trying to find your type. However, for some people, and especially I would say if you are really close to someone, like sometimes I find people who are trying to find their type will, like, I had a client who at first thought she was a 6, but ended up being a 2, but it turns out her mother was a 6. So as a 2s and 9s, for instance, merge with other people, 3s become what other people want them to be. So if, sometimes it's finding out what your story is, and what your parents' types were, especially, but even siblings could play a part in your story of how your type shows up. But I wouldn't say that's the main factor. I would say it's more of a flavoring or an overlay or something to take into account. Maybe something that might make you look a little bit different than someone else of the same type, but that isn't like a big determining factor.
Awesome. Okay. Thanks, B. All right. So the next question is, I'm curious to learn about being an INFJ 2. I'm self-preservation specifically. Oh, Beatrice has all sorts of interesting things to talk about self-preservation 2s.
Oh, yes. I'm a big expert on that type.
So can you talk a little bit about some of the characteristics or key characteristics of a self-pres 2? And then we'll kind of do some color commentary on what it can look like in an INFJ.
Sure. I'll start off saying a little bit about 2, but then going to self-preservation 2. So 2s tend to be very relationship oriented. They're emotional types. They're in the heart triad. So they tend to be very focused on other people. Their attention goes to others, and they may have more of a sense how other people feel than how they themselves feel, because their attention goes out to others, but it doesn't always go fully into themselves. It takes some work for 2s to actually be more connected to how they're feeling and what they're needing. But their survival strategy is very much oriented around what are other people feeling and how can I tune into them to create rapport, to create a positive connection, because 2s kind of unconsciously try to get their needs met through pleasing other people. It's like, if I please you, if I make you like me, then you'll take care of me. And self-preservation 2s, so each of the 3 kinds of 2s demonstrates a different kind of seduction. And 2s are seductive because when you're not in touch with your needs, but you need to get your needs met through relationship. And you also don't want to ask for what you need directly because you might get rejected. You tend to, it's sort of an unconscious roundabout strategy to getting needs met to seduce other people. So if I make you like me and I'm important to you, then naturally you're going to tune into me and give me what I need. That's kind of the strategy of getting needs met for twos. For self-preservation two, the strategy is, interestingly, seducing like a child seduces in the presence of grown-ups. So being cute, being pleasing, being fun-loving, playful, upbeat, friendly. Self-pres twos can look a little bit like sevens, who are very positive and fun-loving also. But they can also be, self-preservation twos can also be a bit irresponsible, because secretly, and sometimes that secret is kept even from themselves, they really want other people to take care of them. So when I first found out I was a two early on, I really related to two. There was no question I was a two. But when I was on panels with other people talking about being a two with other twos, I never related to like really wanting to help people, wanting to give to people, like wanting to meet the needs of other people so they would meet my needs. Well, that's the unconscious part. Because I always was ambivalent about that. For me, helping and giving was in some ways a way to make people like me. So I knew I wanted to make people like me. And I think it's sort of like having an overconfidence in your own ability to charm people. The self-pres two definitely has that. It's like, I'm going to be cute. I'm going to be pleasant. I'm going to be fun to be around. And first of all, you're going to just like me and want to be around me because I'm all those things. But secondly, you're going to want to take care of me because of that. And again, that part I was very unconscious to. I saw myself more as being someone who could take care of myself, someone who had a lot of energy for certainly supporting other people. But it can be a little more unconscious, that part of actually secretly wanting to be taken care of by others. But there are a lot of ways that self-preservation twos can create unconscious dependencies on others. Like when I learned that I was a self-preservation two, one of the things that is highly embarrassing to admit to you is I realized, even though I was in my late 30s, early 40s, I was still getting partially supported by my parents. So that's a childlike thing, right? I've run into self-preservation twos that are, say, still getting supported by an ex-spouse, and they haven't gotten around to really finding their own career. So self-preservation twos can want special treatment well past childhood, and that's part of why they stay young. It's like the teacher's pet kind of character, someone who's so cute that everyone likes them the most. It's a little bit that kind of thing. And again, when I found out I was a self-preservation two, I was shocked because all my life I'd been the teacher's pet, and I never really set out to do that consciously. But I had all these weird examples of like all through, like in junior high and high school, and even later on when I was in graduate school, of like being the favorite. But it's a survival strategy of like, if you like me the most, if I'm the most special, then again, I'm going to not have to really work that hard to get my needs met. I don't really have to be in touch with my needs, which can feel icky for a two, for any two. It's like, if I'm in touch with my needs, then I'm needy, and pride, which is the passion of the two, doesn't like neediness in ourselves. It can be sort of humiliating to ask for a need to get met and someone to say no. So we avoid that situation at all costs, thus the seduction.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You know, one thing, when we came to you and Aranio, your business partner, you had a personal growth workshop around the Enneagram. There were a lot of twos there that were doing personal growth. One of the things I was surprised about was how much work you did with the twos in the group we were in around pride, around this notion of pride. And I don't know if you want to speak to that or not, but that was a very surprising thing to me, because I don't think twos consciously would see themselves as maybe struggling with that.
Yes. So the passion, for people who don't know, is kind of a central emotional motivating factor in all the types. And we all have a passion, or a chief feature, it's sometimes called. But it's usually unconscious. Now for twos, it's pride, and pride is especially unconscious, and it's really tricky to become conscious of for twos, because pride is kind of, on the one hand, synonymous with a good thing, like being proud of myself, feeling good about myself. It can sometimes be seen as confidence, But it's really different, right? It's more, in this case, it's a little bit more like arrogance, but twos often don't really see themselves as arrogant, especially since they tend to be very supportive and considerate about other people. But it's a little bit like, and one of my favorite Enneagram authors is Claudio Naranjo. And in one of his books in the type 2 chapter, he says, the pride we're talking about here is the pride at the bottom of Dante's hell. So in the Divine Comedy, Dante depicts the Inferno, which is hell, and all the passions are in there, but they're in hierarchical order, interestingly there. Now, of course, in the Enneagram types, all Enneagram types are created equal. We all have capacities for unconsciousness and consciousness, for the good and the bad. But in Dante, pride is at the bottom. It's the sin of Satan, right? And in Dante, like, hell was created by the fallen angel falling into the earth and creating this giant crater, and he's at the bottom, and his sin was pride. So but I think what Dante was saying is we all have pride, and pride is kind of like wanting to be seen as superhuman or super important, and not wanting to see the parts of yourself that don't make you feel super important. So it's a little bit like a puffed up version of yourself, or a self-elevation that you don't see that you're doing, right? And so at first, when I learned that I was a 2, I really didn't get pride, because if you're a 2 like me, and I learned it when I was in my early 20s, I'd always been kind of insecure and had low self-esteem, because if you're always trying to get everyone to like you, especially as a young person, it always feels like people don't like you enough, or you're very attuned to the people that don't like you, or that not everyone does like you, or the guy that you want to like you doesn't like you. And so that's there, but that's the deflated side. That's sort of the I'm not enough, people don't like me, so I feel bad about myself. But there is this inflation side, and the inflation side is very important for 2s to learn about, and something a lot of 2s are not conscious of, even like major Enneagram teachers. People that have done a lot of work, oftentimes 2s aren't very in touch with the pride, and it's not pretty, some of the things that can happen when that happens.
Okay, I've heard you accused of coming down real hard on self-pres 2s, probably because you are one. You have to say at least one really amazing thing about self-pres 2s before we talk about the Infj part.
I mean, I do think, I think we tend to be fun and humorous and sensitive in a good way, empathic in a good way. I'm a therapist, and people would ask me, like, how do you listen to people talk about their problems all day? And it was not a problem for me. I'm always very interested in people, like sincerely interested in connecting with people. So I think there's a lot of good things. And again, I'm highly aware of all the things. And I think part of the reason is I think sometimes in many Enneagram books and teachings, the dark side of 2s isn't really fully expressed, because they are presented as sort of this simplistic helper or giver. And so I think I'm trying to work against that. So it's not that I think that I'm trying to be hard on 2s. It's just that I think it's best for 2s if they get in touch with, the things they're not aware of.
Definitely. Well, and I mean, I'm constantly calling ENCP's dick, so it's okay. Like, we all do it, right? To marry that in with being an INFJ, I would say that the one thing that on a growth level I would look out for is that tendency to create codependent relationships. Yeah. INFJs already have a tendency to create codependent relationships. And I would imagine that type 2s already have a tendency to create codependent relationships. Totally. So that's, again, kind of like when we were talking about INTJs and 5s, you're sort of doubling up on some of the challenges. That becomes your story, not creating those codependent relationships that you give to get, and that you're willing to sort of look over some of the more toxic elements of a relationship because it's serving or feeding whatever the dynamic is. And INFJs already sometimes have a challenge in expressing that they have needs. And so an INFJ type can allow themselves to go unresourced for a long time, because they have a story that they're there to, actually I had an INFJ recently say something that I thought was so brilliant. She said one of the reasons why she really envies people who lead with extroverted feeling or harmony as their dominant or driver is that they're willing to do a fuller service than she is as an INFJ. And so there can also be a tendency to not give a full service and almost feel guilt about it. Like you're serving, but you're not serving as much as you think you should be. So you almost feel guilt. And so you almost feel like you need to hide that part of you. And an INFJ can get into a dynamic where they fall into this comfort zone of serving and getting. But unfortunately, if they're not truly asking, they're not giving a full service, but they're also not receiving one. They're not asking for the full service to really resource themselves. The challenge is that dynamic has a law of diminishing returns, right? It gets to a point where it can't survive this sort of like a halfway give and take. And so I think as an INFJ, one of the most important things you can do is be really honest about what your real needs are. Create an ecosystem that you're not just getting other people's needs, but you're also truly getting your own, and not in a self-pres to maybe quasi manipulative way. Like have it be really open. Like don't feel like you need to almost manipulate or seduce others into serving you, but like be really open with the dynamic and the needs you have. Tap into that introverted thinking or accuracy 10-year-old to get better at communicating truths. Not just sort of, unfortunately, when that part is dominant in an INFJ's life, that 10-year-old, but they're not doing it in a healthy way, it can be, it can actually end up being really critical and perfectionistic. And that could not just be self-critical, it could be critical of others if they're not giving you enough, like in a self-preservation 2 style, if you're like trying to get your need met, but you have not clearly articulated it and they didn't give you enough, to get nitpicky and critical and feel like that must be a sign of something, that must mean something, right? And criticize that. One of the best things to do is get really good at articulating and expressing. And I think that that's probably a growth path for self-preservation 2s as well, is getting good at expressing those needs and communicating them and being very honest.
Yeah, exactly. All of what you just said can apply to 2s and especially self-preservation 2s. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Hopefully that one was helpful. All right. Emily says, how come ENFJs can be more than just 2s? Well, this is a theory that we are all working with. And the answer is, who knows? Who knows how type works in general? But our theory, because we've seen a lot of different combinations, particularly combinations that are unexpected, I personally believe, and I think we all sort of are in agreement, that any Myers-Briggs type can be any Enneagram type. It's just that there are certain trends, like we talked about INTJs being 5s, and there are other trends of type. And also I've seen so many odd, weird combinations that actually make it difficult to diagnose the person's Myers-Briggs type. We have a friend who's an INTP who's actually a self-preservation 2. Very odd type, very odd pairing. And so as opposed to sort of doubling up on the story, like I was talking about with INTJ 5s, he's got a very interesting sort of weird dynamic he's working with there, which makes him almost appear more of a feeler, but he's very much an INTP. And so my observation is you can be literally any type combination. It's just a matter of sort of mastering all of the elements and the nuances of those combinations. And some of them are more unusual than others. But why does it work that way? I don't have an answer.
Right. One thing I would say is I think, of course, we're not going to give up on the interesting task of making connections and finding out what correlations there might be. But I think one thing is, to a degree, we are talking about apples and oranges, because that Myers-Briggs really talks about cognitive functions and what those cognitive functions refer to and all the complexity of the cognitive functions. But when we talk about the Enneagram, we're talking about the cognitive level mixed with the emotional level, mixed with the body or instinctual level. So when you mix those things up, you get something that's a little bit different, although there are definitely similarities. And you can obviously hear some of the similarities here, but I think that might be one reason why it's really hard to make one-to-one correlations, because they're sort of different animals.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Helen says, I'm a type 2 ENFJ mom to an older foster son who is a type 4 INFP. Because I am somewhat healthier too, I'm learning to step back and not help him so much as he enters young adult life. But it's hard to know how to motivate a type 4. He's an unhealthy young 4 who has experienced abandonment and trauma, but he also lives in his own head without pursuing any of these dreams in the real world. Wondering if you have practical advice for this type of relationship. I don't want to be in a codependent relationship or be manipulated by him.
Okay, here's what I'll say. So generally with fours, there's some general things about fours, and then I think it's going to be really important to figure out what subtype he is, because the 3 subtypes of fours are so different, and what motivates them and what they need to do to grow is different. But what I will say, one big thing, and especially with a son, I would say with fours, it's always really important to understand them. So I think it's great that she's being healthy and sort of taking care less, caretaking less, backing off a little bit, giving space. That's all really good. But I think when you do interact, really taking some time to understand, if he's willing to share, how he's feeling and why. And don't assume because as 2s, we often hear a little bit and they go, oh, I get it. I understand what's going on with you, or I know what you should do. But it's really important for us to kind of recognize that we need to give more space to the 4 to really talk about what's really going on for them at a deeper level, and to really hear them on their terms. So that's one thing. And oftentimes if 4s feel understood by you, that is like a really good first step to then knowing more how you can help or not help. And so understanding is really, really big with 4s. Now, the second thing is, it'll be really helpful if you know the subtypes. What you've said so far makes me think it's probably more social 4, because social 4s are the 4s that get much more connected to, over-identified with their emotions, and especially their deep emotions, to the point where it's hard for them to activate in the world. It can be really hard for them to take practical steps to actually get things done, because they can always sort of tell themselves an emotional story inside about why it's not going to work or why they shouldn't do it. And so if he's the social 4, that's going to be the hardest one of the 4. The other 2 4s are pretty good about going into action. So the job is, you sort of diagnosed it right. The job, if they're a social 4, is about finding ways to help them take practical action. And also understanding what the barriers are to that person taking practical action, and supporting them in doing whatever they need to do in a really step-by-step, very empathic way. Because it can be really, especially at that age, it can be very difficult. And, to some way, the thing you'll need to watch out for as a 2 is again, even when you feel like you're backing off, trying to do too much, or feeling like it's your responsibility to get that person to activate. Sometimes people, especially people at that age, will need to kind of face the difficulty of not motivating and themselves, and kind of get to the point where life motivates them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I would say there's a very similar set of, I would give very similar advice as an ENFJ to an INFP. ENFJs lead with extroverted feeling or harmony, which is about emotional sort of simpatico. It's about staying connected. It's about keeping morale up and making sure everybody's okay. Whereas introverted feeling or authenticity, which is what an INFP leads with, is not about being okay at all. It's about being validated. It's about getting permission and feeling permission to explore the full technicolor rainbow of your emotional experience. And one of the challenges that people who lead with extroverted feeling can have is that for them, once they talk out their emotion, the entire purpose was to feel better again. So once they have that connective moment and they vibe and you can't even believe what happened to me today, and then they get it all out, then they're fine, right? They're like, okay, I processed the emotion.
Like a release valve.
Yeah, exactly. But to introverted feeling, it doesn't work that way. It's not just a matter of like releasing the emotions and then being fine. It's a matter of like a full processing and being able to feel them at their full effect.
Well, like simmering a soup on a stove.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Right, over a period of time.
Exactly. And so sometimes what can be confusing to people who lead like FJs is the intent of emotion, or like the relationship that an FP has with emotions at all. Like this is about a deep dive. It's not about feeling better. But what's nice is that when an emotion completely processes, then the person does end up feeling cathartic. they felt like they really were able to do a full processing. So my recommendation is, as an ENFJ, approach the INFP not on a feeling to feeling level, not to help them process their emotion, but get into your co-pilot or auxiliary function of introverted intuition or perspectives to take an almost neutral position, but fully shift perspectives and understand where they're coming from. Almost not even to help them, like not to help them process the emotion, not to, not to like be there for them emotionally, but more to just understand how a person would feel the way that they do. I'm sure you probably actually do this a lot as an ENFJ, but to just sort of be there with them in that space and validate that that is what that person's human experience is, and go, that totally makes sense. When I fully understand everything that's going on for you, living inside of your dream world totally makes sense. I can completely understand why somebody would want to live inside of a dream world as opposed to go out into the outer world. And when an INFP feels really validated, all of a sudden they don't feel a need to hold on so tightly to what the experience is. Like they don't have to fight for their right to feel that way anymore because they're not fighting against anything. They got full validation. They got full understanding. And so then now there's not like an ego attachment to feeling that way. Now there's there's more of an ability to have release and to go, oh, okay. And then that catharsis comes, and now they have a little bit more, they're not fighting for something. And so when you're not fighting for something, you're not taking that defensive position anymore. You're just kind of like, oh, okay. And now you're in a neutral space that can go any direction. And then on top of that, as far as inspiration goes, the co-pilot function for INFPs is extraverted intuition or exploration. And there's a couple different things you can do for a young INFP. First, you can really encourage them to, getting outside, of course, of a comfort zone can be hard, especially if they're still processing trauma. But give like the freedom to go really explore the world, the freedom to go do weird things and be weird, the ability to go have very unusual experiences, particularly in things that they're already interested in, and then finding like-minded people and having really great brainstorming conversations. There's nothing more inspiring to an INP to get around a bunch of people that are into the same thing that they're into, talking about the same subject that they love, and feeling like they can idea generate. And then now you've got something to work with because you've got a spark of fire. It's not just something that they're living inside of their own head. They can't have those conversations by themselves in their own head. They have to have them with people in the outside world. And so they'll want to keep fostering those once they experience it. Once an INP gets a taste of that kind of conversation, it's really hard to go back. So I would actually encourage, and especially if they're a social two, I don't know if there's any crossover here, but let me know. But I would encourage them to actually go find people to have creative conversations, specifically creative conversations, brainstorming conversations about subjects that they're already interested in. And I would imagine that might, I don't know, I'm just making a leap here about them potentially being a social too, but that might be enough fire to generate some interest in maybe turning that into a project.
Social
or maybe,
4.
What's that?
You meant social 4.
What did I say?
Social 2.
Social 4.
Just wanted to
Sorry.
clarify that.
Yeah, thank you. No, I appreciate that.
Yeah,
social 2. Yeah. No, as a social 2. I don't know if there's any crossover there, but maybe just having like a little bit of a spark of inspiration about getting outside of themselves and into the real world, because that's the world of brainstorming. That's the world where ideas mesh together and become new ideas and creativity happens. So I'll kick it over to B to see if that social 2 component.
Social 4.
Social 4
component would work.
Yeah, the social 4, I would say a lot of that really applies. Being validated for their emotions, I would say, is really important, and not trying to talk them out of their emotions. I would go 100% with that. I do think that social 4s, I think it's hard for them to give up the ego attachment to a kind of melancholy or sensitivity or over connection. There's like a comfort with staying stuck in negative feelings. Precisely because they are using the connection to those emotions to avoid taking action in the world. It's sort of like an excuse. Well, it's not going to work out anyway. And again, that comes from the emotion. And I find a lot of times what happens is it's like they get comfortable with a familiar emotion like melancholy or hopelessness, But really that's a defense against trying something new because there's a fear of failure there.
Mm-hmm.
Like, well, if I try and I fail, then I'm really going to think that there's something wrong with me. And 4s tend to have this feeling of deficiency.
Mm-hmm.
So again, I think we've made a leap that there's a social 4, but there's some evidence to believe that. But you also may need to sort of give them some ideas and then give them space. But it is all about practical steps in the world. And I agree also with the piece about if you can suggest, maybe I wouldn't work too hard, that they connect with people with like-minded interests, because sometimes if they can kind of connect from the level of the heart or the passion about something, that can be something that's inspiring.
All right. So next question. What element of the mashup between these two systems most excites you as content creators driving exploration within and between both models?
Ooh, that's a good question. It's a great question.
Mm-hmm.
So do you want to go first?
Yeah, I can.
What excites you about the mashup between Myers-Briggs and Enneagram?
Well, there's a couple different things. I mean, just selfishly, the more I hang out with Beatrice and her business partner, Aranio, and we talk and discuss things around mashup, the more embedded an understanding into Enneagram I have. And so I appreciate that I'm able to really understand this other system in a lot more nuance, and without having to put in the time and effort that I did into, say, Myers-Briggs. Like, I'm getting a lot of benefits. But the other thing I would say is there is a piece of it that helps with typing or profiling. Like, if you understand a person can be an unusual combination, explains a lot of odd behaviors that come up for certain types, like that you're not a very, like, that's a very unusual INTP, isn't it? Right? Like, I know they're an INTP, but how is it that they feel so feeling, but they're definitely an INTP? And then come to find out, like, our friend is a self-preservation too. So there are moments where the diagnostic becomes a lot clearer once you understand the two nodes in that system. But I would say the thing that most excites me is that it's another angle for growth. Enneagram has so many really, like, it's at its heart a spiritual model, and Myers-Briggs is not. And I think what really excites me is that there's a spiritual component to the Enneagram that I think helps in understanding the whole person and addressing pieces of them that Myers-Briggs can only kind of touch on. That you can kind of only sort of have an ancillary or sort of like it kind of goes in that area, but not much. And I think the Enneagram gives a really nice complement by addressing some of the more spiritual components and just elements of growth, like directly addressing the ego that you can do with Myers-Briggs, but you have to insert it yourself. So that's probably the most interesting piece to me.
Yeah, I can't help feeling like I think I get excited about, like, somehow cracking the code, like, how are they related to each other? I mean, there's got to be an explanation. There's 16 Myers-Briggs types and 27 really Enneagram types. And how can we find certain alignments that explain things in such a way that creates more understanding of the varieties of the way people show up in the world? And of course, like you're saying, how they can grow. Once you really can help someone understand themselves at a deep level, if you have these two ways into understanding themselves, it's sort of like you have more data, you have more kinds of pathways to growth if you can sort of bring them together. And I'm just fascinated to really spend more time when I can at really understanding how can we understand the different components of each system, so such that we can find certain parallels in that are interesting and make sense. And I think it's just a very tricky process, but I kind of want to crack the code somehow.
Yeah. So one of the challenges with adding yet another system in understanding yourself is it gives you another avenue of escape, right? So your Myers-Briggs, you find your Myers-Briggs type and you start down a growth path, and maybe the growth gets a little tough for you. And you go, well, maybe I'm not really this type. And you start to explore Enneagram, and now maybe you have an avenue of going sideways instead of pushing through the thing you need to grow through. So there's a little bit of a risk, but I think also mashing up these two systems can remove the sidelining or the avoidance of some growth. Because when you come down to maybe something that's really tough for your type in the Myers-Briggs system or on the Enneagram system, and you're like, well, maybe I'm not this type. Let me do some more investigating before I actually push myself and grow. Type can be explained, maybe some modifiers can be explained by the other systems. Some fidelity can be added to go, no, you really are an INFJ. It's just that you're a 7 instead of the common 2 of INFJs. Maybe a lot of INFJs are 2s, but you're a 7, so you're going to show up different. So don't delay in pushing yourself in the growth work. Keep on it, keep pressing. It's just a little bit of a different expression of INFJ, and now you can double down and grow even faster. So I'm excited because I think it gives there's an opportunity for some distraction. So there's a little bit of a challenge with that, but ultimately I think it gives us an opportunity to stay focused on what we're doing, to explain things that might have us go down rabbit trails of trying to discover more about our other types that we might be. So that's what I'm excited about, is it focuses back on action and growth in mashing those two up.
Yeah, there'll be nowhere to hide.
That's right.
Having an escape route.
Well, and I think that's why we're attracted to Beatrice's stuff, is because V is like us. She's a growth nerd. And so we always like bring it back to that subject. So, I mean, as long as maybe if we can crack the code and then like infest it with a bunch of growth, content early on.
That's right.
That'll be how everybody experiences it.
Exactly. It's a growth map.
And I would say this for people that are maybe watching or thinking about this, I think there is complexity here. I think there's a lot of people that have tried to oversimplify these two systems crossing over, just, well, this type matches up with this type, one-to-one correlation. And I think I would caution about that. I think there's more complexity here. As we all dive into this, we understand just how complex some of the mashup is in this. And it's exploratory, it's discovery. A lot of things are emerging as we work with these two systems. And I think it's important that we leave room for the complexity that's there and don't try to make it too simple, too quick, and make things just oversimplified. I don't know if there's much value in that, unless doing that for a time helps you grow. Again, that the route point, or the point to come back to, the orientation point, I should say, is, does this help you get into action to grow yourself in your life and become a better version of who you are now, tomorrow, right? That's the question you should be asking. If it does, personally, I don't know if you feel this way, Beatrice, but I don't care if you believe something false for a time to do that, as long as it's not damaging to you long-term. Whatever helps you get into action to grow, that's like the metric that does there. And then these things come along to support. These systems are tools that support us in our growth journey. They're not ends in themselves, right? They're tools for us.
I would agree. Okay. Similar to previous question about the psychological influences on instincts in childhood, is it possible to repress two instincts for some time before discovering what works? For example, repressing both self-pres and social before finally settling in self-pres upon discovering it's more feasible. So do you repress two of your instincts, not just the third one?
What we usually find, the vast majority of the time, I've never really seen that, is more that one is dominant, one is sort of secondary, and one is repressed. I've rarely seen a person where it isn't that way. So I think your second one can be more repressed or more dominant. Like for me, I have self-preservation dominant, my sexual instinct is repressed, and I have social in the middle. And when I was younger, my social wasn't that well developed. Like I would be very uncomfortable, like when speaking in front of people, whereas social twos are very good at speaking in front of people. And I would, almost like cry every time I opened my mouth. I was very sort of self-protective and not very open to the group. So you could say it was more on the repressed side. But when I put some energy into shifting, like my social instinct, like I took a group facilitation training program, and then I facilitated groups for many years. I was the leader of an organization for a while. Like those were things that didn't come easily at first, but with training and focus, I got a lot better. And it's much harder if the instinct is repressed to get a lot better. I mean, sometimes you have some access to it, but in other ways you don't. And so I would say that it's usually, it could probably be more that you have a dominant, your second is on the more repressed side and needs some attention. But I find that if you put more attention on that one, you can see a lot of progress. Whereas with the repressed one, it kind of keeps going under the water. It keeps it's hard to get a handle on, to create a big shift in a way where it's not at times kind of really going, being pushed away.
Well, and I think what I'm starting to understand is that the repressed instinct is one that ends up really kind of causing trouble when it all of a sudden rears its ugly head. Like you've described it as like a beach ball that you're shoving under the water, and you're not always successful, and sometimes it explodes up in your face.
Yeah.
And if the second instinct is something that's been maybe neglected, it might not be very accessible, but I'm wondering if the sort of the algorithm is that it's your second and not your repressed, because it doesn't have those same repression behaviors. It doesn't have that same blows up your face sort of style to it.
Yeah, it's not like totally out of the realm of just what's on your view screen,
Yeah. It would be kind of like in the car model, like the 10-year-old and 3-year-old. You could have like a 10-year-old or tertiary function that's like less developed, but it will never grip you like the 3-year-old or inferior function. Yeah. So that it's like it's got a little bit of a different dynamic tone to it.
Exactly.
All right, good question. All right, so the next question is, I'm an INFJ, self-pres 2. Another INFJ, self-pres 2. Okay. Something I'm struggling with is I have an almost constant internal conflict between feeling old and feeling young at the same time. This is impacting my confidence level in my work, wavering between feeling like I know what I'm doing and feeling like a toddler who has been handed car keys. Any advice for how to find a way to stabilize?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the job for the self-preservation too. The growth path is really about growing up. So I think it's normal to have some areas of either competence or feeling adult, but really the part that feels young, that goes to a young place, that periodically throws a temper tantrum or gives up really easy, feeling like I can't do it, I'm not capable enough. That's the part that really needs attention. So the fact that sometimes you feel old is good. Sometimes you're competent and independent. Sometimes you can do things. That's great. That shows that there are some things that you're doing well, but I would target my growth effort on the part that needs to grow up and needs support in that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it depends on what kind of work. As an INFJ, it kind of depends on what kind of work you're doing. But that introverted thinking or accuracy 10-year-old or tertiary function is very focused on competence, on being competent. And because it's a 10-year-old or tertiary, it can get a little insecure about how competent it is. And so it's oftentimes just a question mark because you don't know how to self-assess. Like you're not 100% sure whether or not you're competent enough. And I think it's also the work of an INFJ to stay in the extroverted feeling or harmony co-pilot, which is there evidence that I am meeting the needs of my job? Like, what evidence am I seeing that I'm not competent or capable? Is this just an insecurity that's coming up for me? Or am I actually seeing evidence that I need to maybe develop some skill? And as opposed to taking an ego hit on that, just going, okay, well, I guess that's the next skill I need to build. And sort of having more of a philosophical tone to it. So just know that it sounds like in both the systems, there's a natural insecurity around competence and capability. And for both, it's a growth phase to sort of take it philosophically and go, well, if I need to build more skill, I will. And if I don't have any evidence of it, then maybe I need to not be so worried about this question.
Right. And I think for most self-pres twos, this is why sometimes it can be hard to identify yourself as a self-preservation two. You don't necessarily feel young in every realm or about everything. It's just something that predominates in different ways.
Okay. I'm a sexual 7 ENTP. How do you navigate the sexual push-pull nature in intimate relationships? The wanting to be so close that you need to know everything about them and then desperately needing space from them. This is a very good question. I'm resonating with that already. And when you don't know what is going on in their minds and life, you are consumed by your relationship status and can't focus on anything else. Communication alone doesn't seem to be the answer to this. And I am imagining you are in a monogamous non-relationship to create pretend space so as not to smother yourself or your partner isn't a long-term solution. Suggestions. All right. Well, Samantha, I guess this one's on me because I'm a sexual subtype and I'm an ENTP. Well, I'm not a 7, I'm a 3, but and
this person's an ENTP, is that right?
ENTP, same type.
Sexual 7.
Right.
Yeah. Sexual 7. All right. Beatrice is probably going to have a lot of really great stuff to say that I'll be taking notes on as well. But I would say that there's a double up that we do here too, which is that intimacy is created with the introverted functions and connection is created with the extroverted functions. And as an ENTP, we're using introverted thinking as our intimacy building function, or one of them. And that is what is going on inside the other person's mind, right? Sharing what's going on in our minds, sharing our radically honest truths, sharing how our mind is working and all the things that we're thinking, and getting inside the headspace of the other person, wanting to know what their radically honest truth is. What are they thinking? What's going on for them? What's happening inside their noggin? And as a sexual subtype, one of the ways that I determine the health of the relationship is that I am constantly in dialogue with the other person. I'm sharing all of my thoughts and I'm getting, and Joel's like, and I'm getting all of their thoughts. And it's so hard for me to not always be asking that question. Now, I lucked out, and I have kind of lucked out in the relationships I've had. I've always been in relationships with people who love talking. And so, we just kind of perpetually talk. And so what happens when I'm not able to do that? There is a sense of, are we not close? Did we somehow lose connection? Why isn't the other person insanely curious about what's going on for me? And I'm insanely curious about what's going on for them. I guess I'll just say that I resonate with it. And I'm realizing as I talk, I don't know if I have advice. I think he's going to have to be the person who gives both of us advice on this one. So, because okay. I don't know if I have a solution other than just find somebody who wants to talk your ear off.
And can you remind me of the exact question the person's wanting a suggestion or help around?
Yeah, remove the ENTP part. I think you might want to just
push-pull nature.
Push-pull. Mm-hmm.
The wanting to be so close that you know everything about them and then desperately needing space from them, which is also kind of an ENTP thing too, because, and I will say this, I do know this part. When you are balancing extroverted feeling or harmony with introverted thinking or accuracy, the challenge is that, particularly when it's in your 10-year-old or tertiary position, extroverted feeling or harmony, the only way you can get space, actually, if it doesn't matter what position it falls in. The only way you can get truly alone time space is if you don't feel that the other person's needs, if you feel the other person's needs are nowhere on your radar. So sometimes they have to be physically gone. Because if they even trigger that they have a need around you, like because you're probably quite observant as an ETP, if you see that like they're thirsty or they're cold on the couch and would like a blanket, or they're wandering around looking for something, or whatever it is, that's going to make your extroverted feeling perk up and go, oh, there's a need going unmet. I should go help them meet it. So the only way to actually truly get alone time or space is oftentimes to be like physically separated from them. Or just have like a very clear articulation of a boundary. Listen, I'm getting alone time. I'm going to pretend like you don't exist. And I've actually said this to Joel on a number of occasions. You don't exist as far as I'm concerned right now. If you talk to me, I'll be upset with you. Like I need alone time, and that means you don't exist right now because I can't get alone time if I'm constantly checking in with your needs are. And so the push-pull relationship of the sexual subtype is wanting to stay intimate and connected, but then needing them to basically not exist when you need alone time. And so I guess I do have a little bit of bias on that one, which is be very clear about that. Understand that that's what's going on for you. What's happening for you, the reason why you need alone time is because you need to have their needs nowhere on your radar. Like it's almost like you have to dehumanize them for a time and go, none of what is going on for them is any of my business. And what I've done with Joel is I've said, you don't, like for the next hour, you don't exist. There's an hour in the morning that I bet that feels
great.
Yeah.
Oh, it's fantastic.
Super awesome, right? There's an hour in the morning that everybody knows is my alone time. And if they happen to get up early and come downstairs, like, I don't even want them acknowledging me. Like, I don't, like, all, my stepson Gunnar, who's 14, I will nod at him. I will nod at him to acknowledge that he exists. And then that's it. We do not talk. And he's an ENTP too. So it works out. But it's like basically kind of setting that expectation. When I need time away from you and space away from you, it doesn't mean I don't love you and I don't want to be connected. It means that that's the only way that I can truly feel like I have alone time. And then when we come back, then I want to go back into the Vulcan mind meld. because I got my alone time. I'm nourished, I'm resourced, I'm refreshed, and now I can come back and now we can go back into the conversation. So I think having clear communication on what's going on for you and then letting them know that that's why that there's this weird sort of yin yang dynamic going on. Mm-hmm. All right, now I'm going to kick the ball over to B, who's going to tell me all sorts of amazing things, and I will be taking notes.
Well, first I'll say a little bit about sexual 7 in particular, because I do think there can be a kind of push-pull thing here, because the sexual instinct makes the person want to really merge with the partner. And the 7 to some degree does also, because 7s tend to be really interested in people and fascinated by people, and they love interacting with people. However, 7s are also head types. And so there will be times when the 7 wants to go away, wants to be able to think their own thoughts, that wants to be able to pursue their own interests. So there is a natural, I think, like going in two different directions for the sexual 7. Really, some of the 7 and the sexual instinct wanting to merge, but part of the 7 kind of wanting to be able to be free, actually, because 7s really don't like to be limited in any way by anybody else. They don't want to be told what to do. They want to be able to do whatever they want when they want to. Now, a couple other aspects of this, I would say, first of all, and this is to some degree for people with dominant sexual instinct, but also sexual 7, is make sure you're building in time to focus on other people, right? Because other friends, for instance, people that you like a lot that aren't your partner, right? Because sexual dominance will kind of be like, everything is about the partner. Everything is about that one person. Now, there could be a couple, 2 or 3 of those in your life, but the partner will be the main one. And so spread out that interest or that need for connection to other people. Develop deeper friendships with people that you really, really like, so that some of the time you can go spend time with that person. And it's not, just too much of a good thing can be not a good thing. And when you do get too much, because sometimes the sexual, especially the sexual 7, will have a big forward momentum to learn everything about the person and think the person is awesome. But it's healthy to kind of go away sometimes too. So I would think about that as not necessarily as an unhealthy push-pull, but building in some healthy distance, some healthy outlets for you to get your relationship needs met through ways other than the partner. Now, another thing about sexual 7 is they tend to exist a lot in their imagination. And it can be a lot about how amazing the relationship is or the person is. And there can be a little bit of a tendency to overlook what's not working, right? To overlook the problems, to not really want to have the difficult conversation. So I would self-observe to see is the pushing away part when it's like, oh, I've been around this person long enough and now we're having some sort of tension or we're having some sort of issue that really we probably need to have a difficult conversation about to, like all healthy relationships do. But that may be when, oh, interestingly, I don't want to be around you anymore. So for a sexual 7, I would be really on the lookout. Is that pushing away also about wanting to avoid dealing with the hard stuff and only really want to be like totally together with the good stuff, or the good stuff as you imagine it in your mind, which probably it partly is in reality, but maybe isn't completely in reality. Because sexual 7s can have the tendency to make a relationship or a person much better than they actually are. And if you're going to be in a good long-term relationship, you want to be with the real person. And so build in not only time to be away from the person, like Antonia said, or to have develop stronger friendships and relationships with more people, but also really try to catch yourself if part of the wanting to push away is you're not really dealing with the real person or the real issues. You're just all of a sudden sort of wanting to be free to not have to deal with anything negative. So I would have that question for the sexual 7 in particular, and make sure, you're sticking around also for the hard stuff, which actually, if you deal with the hard stuff, it can bring a natural balance into the relationship, right? Sometimes we're together and it's amazing. And then because we're both human, we're going to run into things we don't love about each other, or we're getting into conflicts. And if we deal with that, there can be kind of a natural coming apart, a natural these are our differences, or these are ways we aren't perfect together, or these are the ways we just need to get needs met somewhere else. And if you deal with that more honestly, it might not be this like total merger and then get away from me kind of thing. It can be more a healthy balance of being together and also having a bridge to cross, being able to be apart in ways where you don't agree on everything or you don't love every 100% of the things about that person. There's some things that kind of bug you. And so it's actually nice to have time on your own so that it's more of a healthy balance like that.
Beatrice, what I think I hear you saying is that sevens might have, sexual sevens in particular, might be unaware of the crucial conversations or difficult conversations they need to have as a particular type. And that could be a really great pathway of growth for a sexual seven to like focus in on what conversation. And there's a great resource called Crucial Conversations. Is a book about how to like have those really difficult conversations that we've used with some of our clients and people that we've talked with. What I hear you saying is there's value in really focusing on what conversations are challenging that I'm not having with my partner or the people that are important in my life.
Right.
And like find that pathway forward. Cool.
Right.
And that's also a very ENTP thing to do too, is if you are just looking at the most optimistic element of a relationship, that could be a bit of a loop for an ENTP. That could be their extroverted intuition, extroverted feeling loop. And the truth that lives in the introverted thinking might need some addressing. So really do that Vulcan mind meld with all the bad stuff too, not just the good stuff. Mm-hmm. Good.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks
All
for the
right.
question.
Thank you, Samantha. I learned a lot too. I knew you'd have a better answer than me.
I wouldn't say better or worse.
All right. INTP sexual 9. Philip, could integrating the lower function extroverted feeling help a type 9 figure out who they are and gain a healthy sense of self? So he's talking about, the 3-year-old or inferior function of extroverted feeling or harmony, which is what an INTP needs to integrate, which is a feeling of connectivity to other people, feeling connected, feeling a sense of sort of an ability to emotionally express, an ability to tap into society and care about social rules and like sort of how society is set up, and to want to serve the needs of others and to think about things in terms of like having maybe a big game plan through acts of service or through helping the majority of people. Could integrating that part of them be a way to gain a healthy sense of self as a type 9?
And maybe you could even address ways to find a healthy sense of self as a type 9, and we could find the correlation as well.
So are you saying that the harmony piece is the 3-year-old?
For an INTP.
Interesting, because that's a little surprising for a 9 and a sexual 9. And so if they're a sexual 9, I would wonder if they're social repressed, because some of what you were describing as part of this harmony thing that might be an inferior function sounds to me like maybe that it's the social piece, because you were talking a little bit about the collective and being of service, and that I wonder if there's an instinct piece in here that's really important, because the social instinct is all about being of service. Now 9s are very oriented toward being connected and to harmony. So that's why it's an interesting thing here. And so I wonder if one of the interactions could be this instinct piece. I would say overall 9s really need to connect with themselves and not just other people, right? So 9s tend to automatically focus on other people, and with the sexual 9 really on like the partner, the important person. They almost merge with the other person, like there are no boundaries there. They take on the attitudes and opinions of the other person. So the growth path for all 9s is really getting more in touch with what they want, because it can be very hard, for you. If you ask a 9, what do you want? It can be hard for them to answer that question. And so then it's even harder for them to act on their own behalf, in their own self-interest. And so it's really good for 9s to get a little more, learn to create more healthy separation with other people and put more focus on themselves and get much more in touch with what do I want, what's my agenda, and then how do I take action on behalf of myself.
So one thing I would add here is the other thing that extroverted feeling does is it helps a person create healthy boundaries. So it depends on which aspects of that extroverted feeling is the key component that the INTP needs to integrate. And so what I'm hearing you
Right.
say is the crossover here is the focus on creating healthy boundaries. Where do I end and the other person starts? Because INTPs go one of two directions. They either completely resist the idea of connection and push it away and go, well, I don't need that. Or they're almost like sitting ducks in a relationship. They hand too much over. They don't have a good idea of how much they need to serve in order to maintain the relationship. And so then they overdo it and end up in codependent relationships. And so it sounds to me
So
like
that would be the 9 part on that latter.
there you go. And if
Nine,
this is
yeah,
the
yeah.
Philip I think it is, if this is our INTP Philip, that is actually something that we've discussed, is the idea of creating healthy boundaries. So having the 9, understanding that the 9 has a tendency to do that as well, hand too much of themselves over, do too much merging, then it seems like the growth path for both a sexual 9 and an INTP integrating extroverted feeling or harmony is really healthy boundaries, understanding where you end and the other person begins, and maintaining that.
Yes. And for a sexual 9, that necessarily means more time by yourself. Physical separation is really important, even more than what Antonia was describing around the last question, where she needs like an hour where you don't exist. It's more than that for the sexual 9. They need to like actually go out of the house and take up a hobby that is all their own, or they need to spend a weekend by themselves without the partner, or one day a week where they don't see the partner. I mean, there needs to be build in much more physical separation, because it's very hard for sexual 9s to make boundaries.
One of the challenges with INTPs is that there's a sense that there's not very many people out there that they can connect with. And so there's a scarcity mentality they bring into relationships. They feel like they have to like really overdo it with this 1 or 2 people, because those are the only people that they'll ever be able to connect with. Because there's a sense that they don't know how connection works. And so if they've magically found this person, this bird of paradise, then they've got to really maintain that relationship and really give and merge with them. And so a part of this too, I think that would be good, is having abundance mentality, knowing that no relationship is the end all be all, that there are many, many, many people out there you can connect with. So it's okay to have those boundaries. If a person does not want to enter a relationship with you that has healthy boundaries, then they're not a bird of paradise. You might be able to connect with them, but they're not the kind of relationship you want. So to foster an abundance mentality around relationships is probably good here too.
And how do you foster an abundance mentality as an INTP? We talk all the time about growing that co-pilot of extroverted intuition. You go out and get more reference experiences. You try more things. You meet more people. You stretch your comfort zone. Now you have more reference points for, oh, there is abundance out here. If you stay at home and you do research on the internet, you may not feel that way. So again, this cycles back to what we've always encouraged INTPs to do, which is grow that co-pilot, grow that co-pilot, grow that co-pilot of extroverted intuition.
And it sounds like Beatrice is saying, make sure you have plenty of alone time, which almost might be a challenge for an INTP that already is likely to get tons of alone time. So you might have to have a really good balance here of understanding that the alone time you need is actually boundary time. It's actually, don't think of it as alone time. Think of it as boundary setting time.
Right. It's time connecting with myself and what I like to do and what I'm doing for myself, my own sense of purpose, something that feels important to me, something I'm developing in myself, that kind of thing. It's not like, it might help that sexual 9 not to think you're getting away from that person, but more you're connecting, you're leaving space for you.
Right.
Yeah. And if the social instinct is repressed, maybe a good thing to do would be to go be by yourself and go be of service, or join some sort of group or collective as part of what you're doing, but it has to be something that feels really important.
So then it's not just alone time, it's actually self-assertion time.
Yeah.
And oftentimes people need alone time to assert who they are, but for an INTP, this might look a little different. And this is one of the nuances of a mashup. Oh, I'm so excited.
Yes.
For an INTP, it wouldn't just be alone time connecting with self. It would actually be self-assertion time, which is getting out there and connecting with other people and something that's bigger. And so, and finding yourself in that. So then the answer would be yes, Philip, integrating extroverted feeling as like a sort of a bigger concept of serving bigger, more people.
Right. Finding a sense of purpose. Yeah. That is
Exactly.
yours and not the partner's.
That's right. That would be the key in all of that. Fantastic.
Thanks for the question.
Yes, good one. All right, Sophie says, I have an Enneagram question. I find it is more difficult for counter types to witness their passion and do their shadow work as they imitate the virtue. As a self-preservation 2, Enfp, man, you guys are just coming out of the woodwork, aren't you?
Yay.
It is difficult for me to see the pride in my behaviors, and very little literature talks about the counter type shadow work. Do you have any advice to help counter types do their inner work?
Yeah, so counter types, as some people may know, are, for each of the 9 types, there's 3 subtypes based on which of one of 3 instincts is dominant. And for each of the 9 types, there's one of those 3 subtypes that we call a counter type because it goes against the flow of the passion. In some cases, exactly like she's saying, there's a way that the passion isn't so obvious either on the outside or on the inside. Like sometimes a person will say they don't really relate to that passion. So the self-preservation 4 is the counter type of the 4, and sometimes they don't relate to envy as much as the other 4s, partly because they go into action to prove themselves, to get what they want that they're lacking, before they really have a chance to register envy. And of course, it's uncomfortable feeling these emotions that are the passions. So we're motivated to be unconscious of them anyway. I would say for counter types who, again, tend to be sort of at, it's almost like the instinct is going in one direction and the heart is going in the other direction. So it's sort of like a mismatch, like the sexual 5. 5s are kind of moving away from people, wanting to get more into their heads and sort of make more boundaries. But the sexual instinct drives toward people. So there's an opposition, and that's partly what can create a lack of awareness of the passion. I think for self-preservation 2, I told my own story. It was hard for me to understand what the passion was. In some cases, I think she's really right. It's a lot about seeing it as shadow work, seeing it as what do I need to be aware of in myself and how do I do that? And I think that Enneagram points very clearly to what 2s generally need to do, but what self-preservation 2s can also do. And that is, looking at ways that situation and ways that you need to be more important than you actually are. Now, humility is the virtue, but we need to be careful here because some self-preservation 2s think they're in touch with humility when they're making themselves small. Because like social 2s can make themselves big, they like to be in front of people and competent and leader types, and their pride is more obvious to everybody and sometimes not obvious to themselves. But self-preservation 2s, they don't look that prideful because they're making themselves small. It's like, oh, who me? I'm nobody. I'm not big enough or competent or adult enough to do this or that, and so it can look like humility, but it's really not, because deflation is just as much pride as inflation, right? It goes both ways. Deflation is sort of a counter reaction to being inflated, right? If I'm inflated and I think I'm really important, but then you kind of say something inadvertently to insult me and make me feel like I'm not important, then it's like I deflate like a balloon. So now I feel really bad about myself, or I make myself small, or now I don't want to show up. That's not humility. Humility is having a realistic appraisal of yourself. It's not making yourself bigger than you actually are or smaller than you actually are. It's being who you are and owning that, right? So I've had to work on, it was really hard for me to write a book, right? Because I was what's this person going to think or that going to think? I can't really do this. I was constantly kind of disempowering myself, right? And so, but then when I actually the book was going to get written, and it might even be a good book, now I start imagining I'm going to be interviewed by Charlie Rose on TV. That's the inflation part. So I'm afraid to do it, but now imagining it's going to be, on the bestseller list, Well, the truth is it's not on the bestseller list, but it's actually a pretty good book. So it's like not making myself too small or not make, so yes, the counter types do have to work harder, but usually what it's about is starting with getting more in touch with the passion, right? And understanding what the passion really is and how it's playing out for you. And yes, that can definitely be synonymous with shadow work, which is about looking at our blind spots and the parts of ourselves that we don't want to see. And sometimes for self-preservation too, it can be hard to really see all the ways you're making yourself small and not just owning your power and owning who you are, because like I have fear of pride, right? So if I own my power and I start being big and I'm the Enneagram expert, now I'm worried that everyone's going to think I'm arrogant and I'm too much and I think I know everything, and now they're not going to like me. right? So it's a little bit back and forth. And so it's more about like owning your power, owning what's actually true about yourself, and growing up in that and owning your authority, and being aware, like, okay, when am I puffing myself up, or when am I wanting that person to think like I'm the be all end all, you know, versus when am I, okay, I'm as important as I am, but I don't need to disempower myself or need to be everything to everyone. So, so I think the counter types can struggle more with that, because like, for instance, social 7 doesn't really look like they've got gluttony, right? But it's gluttony for being seen as a good person, as opposed to gluttony for a lot of options, or for seeing the world as, you know, in terms of everything's the most optimistic it can be. So, yes, counter types need to work harder at this, but I would start with being aware of how the passion is manifesting in ways that are obvious and ways that are not obvious, and working to make, and it's almost like the more you're aware of the passion, and the more you're not running away from it or trying to hide out from it, the virtue naturally arises. You don't really have to work for the virtue. I mean, at some point you can sort of manifest it more consciously, but a lot of it is work with the passion and different things, different themes in your life that might be related to that. You know, like self-pres 2s are going to still, you know, think that they can make everyone like them. They're going to still, you know, want to be really important to particular people in their lives and feel really bad if they aren't important enough. And sometimes it can be like they can never get enough attention. So all of those things are still going to be in place. So it's looking at those things and how they're expressions of pride.
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks for the question.
Definitely. There was 2 questions that were emailed in, and I think they almost have some crossover to them. Somebody mentioned that you guys, Joel and Beatrice are both ENFPs. Beatrice, you're a self-preservation 2, and Joel is a social 6. So can you kind of talk about some of the distinctions between the 2 of you, and maybe use that illustratively for how the same Myers-Briggs type can show up differently depending upon what Enneagram type they are?
Well, Joel, why don't you talk first about how you see the ENFP playing out for you particularly?
Yeah. So from an ENFP, or like pushing Enneagram aside, so as ENFPs, we typically, we lead with a process of extroverted intuition, exploration. So it's all about outside pattern recognition. Almost like we move through life like it's one big brainstorming session in a lot of ways, right? We're like moving through life, test iterating things, pushing buttons in the outer world. And depending probably on our Enneagram type and, you know, how we're raised, it depends on how much we're willing to push those buttons in some ways. So I probably have a little bit, and I'm also social, so I probably have a little bit more of a threshold of discomfort in the outer world of pushing people's buttons and making people feel uncomfortable, because I have a natural belief in myself that I can break social rules and recover quickly by just fixing it, like finding my way through it, like smoothing it over, finding my way through it pretty quickly. And you probably have some of this too, Beatrice, but I have a tendency to overdo that. I have a tendency to push people a little bit harder than maybe most other people would, and test things with like breaking social rules and trying to see how people respond and get feedback in that way from an ENFP side. My growth path, and both of our growth path, is to grow our introverted feeling process, which is authenticity. Find out what's really important to us. Find out about what resonates, what's authentic for us, not what just works or gets something accomplished or is efficient, but what truly is something we want to attach ourselves to, something that we really believe in, that we're passionate about, that is something that's meaningful to us. And it can be a challenge because we usually have high energy as ENFPs. We want to get a lot of things, not just things done. We want to get a lot of things done. We want to start opening a lot of loops and try a lot of new things and meet a lot of people and see a lot of the world. And often this can be something that we're doing that, and then we're like, okay, let's execute on all this stuff. And it's like, well, what's actually important here? You're going an inch deep and a mile wide, and you're not really accomplishing anything with your life, or you're not really sinking your teeth in anything meaningful. So a lot of ENFPs have to stop, find out what's important to them, all the 500 projects and things they've started and all the things they've got going on. What's actually important to you as an ENFP? Choose those things and then start to execute and move down the road and get deeper into those things that are actually resonant with you as a person. So that's really the growth path for us as ENFPs in the Myers-Briggs side.
Interesting. So, and I'm really starting to see, like, if there's sort of a range of characteristics associated with a particular Myers-Briggs type, I'm starting to see like certain ones are really highlighted for someone of a certain Enneagram type, and other ones are more highlighted for someone of another Enneagram type. So I would say I mostly relate to all of that, but there's some things I don't relate to as much as what you just said, but other things that I relate to a lot. It's very interesting. So there's a big overlap, but like a few things that are sort of de-emphasized for me. I would say that I think both of us are high energy. That's one thing. Now, I think that for me, it comes from especially being a 2, but just being who I am. And I think there may be something that is in common with the 2 and the social instinct. So I think that there's a lot about like other 6s may not be as high energy as you are, as button pushing as you are, as exploratory as you are, as like interested and engaged in the world as you are. Some 6s, you know, especially self-preservation 6s and even some sexual 6s can be much more introverted, much more sort of, I'm not sure about this. I'm not sure I trust enough. And so it sounds like there's a way that your energy, especially from being a social 6, is really out there in the world and wanting to connect and create sort of community and those kinds of things. And I would say I resonate a lot with that as a 2, like wanting to connect with people, wanting to use my high energy to explore the world and travel and meet people and do things and do a lot of things all at once. I would say all of those are true for me as well. I would say what doesn't resonate for me as much is the button pushing part. I would say I'm more on the side of, because I want people to like me, I'm much more like, I don't necessarily, like I might want to push a button, but I'll either won't, or if I do, I'll get really scared right after. Right? Like, uh-oh, like I do that on Facebook sometimes. Like I can't hold myself back from making a comment to set people straight about Enneagram theory. But then I like run away and hide because I'm like, oh man, I didn't want to push that button and create some sort of explosion that I don't want to deal with later. So there's some of that as well. It was funny when you said brainstorm. I would say, although I probably want to be part of the brainstorm, it's not something I would lead the charge on. I even think of that more as a head type word. But it's like, I like ideas and being with people and talking about ideas, but like, I'm not like the quintessential brainstormer. But on the other hand, I really related to what you talked about in terms of the growth path. It sounds a little bit like becoming more authentic, which I think can be both a 2 thing, like I'm whoever you want me to be, right? Which could also be a little bit of a social 6 thing, especially since social 6s on one hand are oriented toward finding a good authority and following that authority. And that authority can be like a system or, you know, dedicating themselves to a community. But there can be sort of like, I'm following the rules, or I'm doing something so I don't get seen as not doing the thing the authority wants me to do. So there can be a little bit of a not being completely true to your authenticity because of that. And you have to kind of have the courage of your conviction a little bit more, and maybe even own your own authority and go against the authority if that's what's authentic to you. For me, it's about like shape shifting into what people want me to be. And so a whole thing is, who am I really? You know, and can I say that honestly without worrying as much about what other people think of me, you know? And for me, that might be everybody or an important person. For you, it might be, you know, people who are important in your world and authorities as well. And then the other thing is that things have to have meaning. I think that's, as I've grown, I've been more able to manifest that in my life. It's always been important, but it's been taken sort of a back seat, you know, maybe to reference the car metaphor, to doing what I thought I was supposed to do. But now it's much more about doing what has meaning for me and doing what's authentic to me. And I think now I'm much more willing and even can take a little pleasure in pushing buttons now that I can sort of stand behind what has meaning for me and explore the world more from that, as opposed to just wanting to connect or get something from people.
Yeah, it's probably the flavor of button pushing that's influenced by our Enneagram types.
Yeah.
I think like if I'm in touch with myself as a social 6, I think what I'm doing is I'm testing people's ability to hang, like people's ability to like keep up, or not keep up like intellectual or anything, but more like, can you take what I'm giving you? If you can take this, then we can do stuff together.
Right.
And I'm typically, that authority thing, I'm usually vetting not for people to like me, but for people to follow me. That's typically what I'm after. I'm trying to find, will this person follow my lead or not? Or will I have to be following their lead? And that's like always kind of this unconscious, I think, push-pull thing that I'm struggling with all the time, or like working through all the time.
Is there also a question about, can you be trusted, and can we connect from a place where I can trust you? Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
So it might be that too, because I also have trust issues, and I want to
guess
connect.
Motivations. Yeah. Motivations and intent is like crazy second guessing all the time.
I think ENFPs generally have trust issues because they're always questioning people's intent.
Yeah.
Yes. Now, not all twos have trust issues, but self-pres twos do.
But the ENFPs ones probably do too. The other thing I would say is Joel is being in the head center. It probably has a different relationship with his extroverted thinking 10-year-old or effectiveness 10-year-old than an ENFP in the heart center, which is probably one of the reasons why he's so focused on leadership and wanting people to follow him. As extroverted thinking is trying to get things done and mobilize people to make things happen. And so there's probably more of a weight on the thinking part of him than there might be with other ENFPs.
Actually, there's a nuance here. Less than followership. It's probably this Enneagram 6 thing. It's less about people liking. It's more about people supporting. Maybe that's even a better word than following.
Yes. It's sort of like, are you part of the club that I'm holding the flag for? You know.
Yeah. So I know I've got your support if things go down, right? It's kind of this gnawing thing. I want to know that I've got almost a resource way, like people to support if crap hits the fan someday.
Exactly. And social sixes have a little bit of a, are you sort of with me or against me kind of thing. Like who are the good guys and the bad guys? Like who's on my team versus not.
Yeah. Yeah.
So another person wrote in and said, it seems like Enneagram 6s and ENFPs have so many similarities. So how can you parse out what's being an ENFP and what's being an Enneagram 6? And I would say one of the best ways to do that is to just look at the functions and all the ways they can show up. And I think Beatrice is a great example of being an ENFP that's not a 6. Like you've built your entire life around traveling the world, teaching people about a system, right? And getting great ideas around all of this and very much exploring, right? Using your extroverted intuition or exploration driver and getting really in touch with who you are and making sure that you're doing something that has meaning to you and getting a lot done as an extroverted thinking 10-year-old. And so the best way to parse it out is to look at examples of ENFPs that aren't 6s and to see how the same cognitive function stack can show up pure, right? Without the influence necessarily being a 6. I will say that one of the big things I have noticed about Joel as a 6 that you don't seem to share is that Joel's major motivation for a long time, and he's been working on it like crazy, and he's like super zen now, but anxiety was his cup of coffee in the morning. Anxiety was how he got everything done. It
was a motivation strategy,
right,
to get stuff done.
Yeah.
And that's very much a 6 thing, right? And I don't think all ENFPs experience this driving anxiety all the time.
Yeah. And I will say that of the 2s, the self-preservation 2 can look a little bit like 6. Like I have a self-preservation 6 friend who she and I look a lot alike. And so I think there are factors like me that are a little more like 6. But again, we relate to a lot of these qualities of the NFP, but from different angles, it sounds like, for slightly different reasons.
Yeah,
exactly. Okay. We will not be able to get to all of the questions, but I want to start seeing if we can get them a little faster. So Isabel has 2 questions. How can an INFJ type balance the need for harmony versus the type 4 compulsion for truth telling? And any ideas how this type combination shows up in a healthy way? I am a self-preservation 4. I didn't know that 4s had a compulsion to tell the truth.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. All right. There you go.
4s are truth tellers. Right. Yep.
Well, and for an INFJ, there's nothing that says, so just as I want to hear more about the type 4 truth telling. I want to make it clear that INFJs, if they are authentically articulating truth, that is very much in support of harmony, because harmony that refuses to tell the truth isn't harmony at all. It's conflict avoidance.
Or
actually,
fake harmony.
right. Yeah, exactly. Telling the truth is actually one of the ways that you bring conflicts out to the open so they can be addressed. And so they can, so true harmony can be preserved. The challenge for an INFJ is when they go to their introverted thinking to be critical and to tell people how it is, not in telling the truth, but in communicating their criticisms or communicating things that aren't true. They are just perspectives that the person has. And then they can get almost gossipy, weirdly enough. But they feel like they're telling the truth. So truth telling supports harmony. It supports the ability to do it by bringing conflicts out. The challenge is when an INFJ thinks they're truth telling when really they're being critical and they're destroying relationships in the process. Because what could be harmonious, they're breaking because they're getting titillated by sort of bringing their criticism out, or having a critical spirit themselves, having a critical heart themselves, which destroys those relationships. So I actually think that the truth telling of an Enneagram 4 INFJ helps the harmony piece, but always if it's in support of it. If your harmony is serving, if your co-pilot is serving your 10-year-old, that's a problem. You don't want to do that. But if your 10-year-old of truth telling is supporting harmony, that actually is a really good dynamic.
Yeah, this is a good question. And so one of the things I talk a lot about with 4s is how they get scapegoated in families and made to carry the shadow. So what 4s often do in groups and in families is they sense what's going on underneath the surface. It's not being spoken about. That's important, the truth. And they feel motivated to surface it. But as you're saying, there are a lot of families and groups that are very invested in maintaining their fake harmony. And although I agree with you that real harmony is created when you bring out all the truths and you do all the work that it takes to incorporate the truth and live more from truth, on the way there, there can be a lot of conflict because 4s come in conflict with people who don't want to hear the truth, right? And and so what happens is there's a lot of negativity about 4s and even pathologizing of 4s because of this function, because it's a very unconscious collective thing to not want to see the truth, right? And 4s can't help but register it, and they feel motivated, usually from a place of wanting to help, wanting to create true harmony, wanting to surface problems so that we can work through them and really come together. But people don't like to hear the truth. That's the problem. And so I think this is a good question, because I think a lot of 4s end up being persecuted or scapegoated. And I mean, a lot of 4s I've had a lot of 4 clients, like you tell the truth and then, no, it's not our problem. It's your problem. You're the problem. And this is part of why 4s walk around feeling like there's something wrong with me, right? Because they try to tell the truth and the whole world is crazy. And they're like, no, you're the crazy one, right? And so this happens to 4s all the time because they can't help know the truth. And so I think part of it is recognizing that thing, that dilemma, having a lot of compassion for yourself as a 4, because that kind of thing is real. And it's hard sometimes to when you don't get validated, when other people don't want to face the truth. So I think a couple things. One is having a sense that that's the situation you're in as a 4, and that sometimes you will meet with resistance, and not to take it on as something wrong with you, but recognize when, okay, these people can't hear the truth right now. And that sometimes might make me want to tell them all the more, but now we're in a power struggle around whether the truth can be heard or not. And that's important to recognize when that's happening. I would say that one thing 4s can do is make clear their positive intention in sharing the truth. I think sometimes people don't see that and they just react against the truth because they're maybe coming up against something in their own blind spot, something they don't want to see or face, or a feeling they don't want to feel. And that can be that resistance can be powerful. I'm coming up against that with a friend in my life right now, where I think there's some blind spots going on and I'm wanting to name them, but that person does not want to go there. And so now we're in a fight, right? So the 4 can say, I want to tell you something, and my motivation is to help. My motivation is to bring more truth and clarity. My motivation is want to have a better relationship. My motivation is to create more harmony. Now, there may be some processing that needs to happen on the way to the harmony, but I'm willing to be here for that. And no one's willing to be there like that, like fours are. So making your intentions clearer, and then, you know, I hate to say it, but recognizing when some people don't want to hear the truth. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you may be able to go along with the fake harmony. Certainly self-preservation fours will be able to do that, tolerate that more than the other fours maybe. But also maybe if you don't want to tolerate a situation where people don't want to hear the truth, maybe that's not the situation that you need to be in. So kind of recognizing that part of that balance is, it may not be your job to bring harmony to every situation. You know, you may not be the only player that says whether it's going to be harmonious or whether the truth can be heard, and to, you know, take care of yourself in that, in terms of whether there are some situations in your life where people can't hear the truth and you can't not be with the truth. And so that means that's not the situation for you.
Yeah. Probably most people watching right now that are interested in personal growth have been working on themselves. And the phrase that rolls up in my head, and maybe this is applicable to fours, is this: you can't want something for someone more than they want it for themselves.
Right.
And like, you can't do the work for them. You can't see the truth for them. Like, I think that's probably something that fours attempt to do, is see the truth and bring it out for somebody else on their behalf. Yeah. And that just, if someone's unwilling to see that, it's just going to be like kind of a futile attempt, as far as I can tell. Mm-hmm. It's a challenging place to be, wanting something for somebody like that. And we probably all have somebody in our life that's the case of, right? Mm-hmm. That we want something for them so much. Like, if only they would fill in the blank. Yes. You know, they could. Yeah.
If only my family could see this truth that they're not willing to look at, then we could all be more honest with each other. You know, family gatherings would be more enjoyable. But again, if you're one person in the system, often the system presses back.
Yeah.
We have actually quite a few questions around being a four and people who use extroverted feeling and introverted thinking. Introverted thinking is usually considered the truth-telling compulsion. And it's interesting that there's an Enneagram type that also has this truth-telling compulsion, but they may not be the same. Like, introverted thinking is a function that TPs use, and most of the people talking about being fours are not TPs. They're FJs or FPs. So there's this compulsion to tell the truth or to need to articulate it. And as you mentioned, a lot of people are actually resonating with this idea of being scapegoated, mm-hmm. because they were the one who pointed it out. I, as an ENTP who uses introverted thinking and can't shut up, I totally resonate with the idea of having a compulsion to tell the truth as well. And there are different ways to get sort of philosophical around it, which is that idea of knowing that sometimes it's just not the right time, the person's not in the right place. And for me, I have focused on the skill of how to tell the truth, because I'm not a four, but I'm an ENTP, how to tell the truth in a way that is a relief because somebody said it. So that's oftentimes how I've focused on it. If I have a compulsion to say the truth in a context or a situation, my first question is, why are we hiding this? What's our secondary payoff to hiding it? Because we must be needing this lie for a reason. So why do we all need this lie collectively? What's it actually doing for us? And how could the truth be more of a relief than whatever the lie is giving us? It's a way of thinking about it to go, well, if right now the truth wouldn't be a relief, right? Like, we wouldn't all collectively feel a sense of relief. We need the lie for this thing. How do I address the thing itself? Because if you dismantle the system of why the lie exists in the first place, oftentimes the truth is looking for escape already. Like, the truth is trapped in the middle of it, wanting to escape. And when it does, everybody will feel good about it. But they need the lie for some reason, because there's been a system set up where the lie is giving us something. And if you start to address the system, and the system is way more complex, it's like there's a lot to it. Lots of generations of dynamics have been playing into it. If we start talking about the truth, literally nobody will listen to, because this is such a complex ball of whatever system it is, that I ask myself, is it worth it to go into that? Like, is it worth my time and effort? Even if these are people I love, is this something that I want to spend a substantial amount of time dismantling? And sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes this is something that's important enough to me and like is worth the ROI on it just so that it will be accomplished. But if the system of the lie is way more than I can handle, but I keep insisting on poking at it as opposed to solving it, but poking at it with the truth, and everybody's getting pissed off at me, I go, well, this is only going to be a Band-Aid anyway, because they're all going to go back to the lie because it's doing something for them. So thinking about it in sort of terms of like, I feel compelled to say something. And what's the compulsion for me? Is this a vanity? Well, of course I'm 3. So is this a vanity project for me? My truth needs to be out there, right? Or is it like this legitimately needs to be handled? I can't oversimplify what I'm talking about. Like, this is oftentimes not a simple thing. It's not just, oh, everybody else is too stupid to know this, so they need me to say it, which of course is how I would interpret it as a TP. It's usually not that. It's usually there's a lot more complexity going on. So if I'm not willing to invest in the complexity of what's happening, usually I have to acknowledge that this is me just wanting to say my truth. And I would imagine that 4s oftentimes feel very invalidated. So oftentimes it's not I don't know about the 4s themselves, but with FJs and FPs, oftentimes it's not a matter of being insistent on the truth. It's a matter of wanting validation for what they're seeing. They need to feel like that they're not going crazy, or they're seeing something that's a legit issue. And sometimes it's just a matter of finding somebody that you can talk to that will give you the validation and understanding you need as an FJ or an FP. So, and sometimes you don't actually, as a TP, I will say, when I nail the truth in a surgical way, when I get it straight to the heart of it and it's a complete truth, it oftentimes dismantles the system all by itself, because it is a relief to hear a complete truth. Most people are waiting for it. But if you go 90% of the way and it's not a complete truth, it's like 90% of the truth, but you still get 10% in there that's not accurate, that's enough for people to keep believing the lie. So maybe you just need to get a more complete picture as well and go back to figuring out what's really going on. So that's the ENTP perspective on the compulsion of saying truth. I'm not an Enneagram 4 and I'm not an FJ or an FP, but oftentimes there's more work to be done. There's more really understanding what's going on. And if it's a sense of validation you need, go talk to somebody and maybe idea generate, maybe figure out what's going on, talk to another person, go, this is what I'm seeing. What am I missing? And the person going, no, I think you've got a good handle on it. And sometimes just feeling validated and feeling like you can talk about it with somebody is enough, even if the actual subjects are not in a place where they can open up and listen to you. So,
Beatrice, what is the motivation for 4's compulsion for truth? Why is a 4 so compelled for this?
Well, I think it can be different things. That's why I think it's a great idea for the 4 to do some work around, like, what's my investment in telling the truth? What's motivating me? What happens if I don't? And I think a lot of times it's because they see something there that other people aren't acknowledging, and it kind of drives them crazy, right? Because they're in touch with a truth that other people are sometimes denying or just not seeing because they're not tuned into that channel. And I think sometimes it's often a sense of wanting to bring out the truth, wanting to be of service, wanting to help people. You know, I've seen this happen in organizations on teams when there's a 4 on the team saying we're not seeing something and it's making us less effective. You know, in a family, it can be like there's some really negative patterns happening and the person wants to bring this to light so they can get healed. I think oftentimes there's that kind of a thing. And I think there can even be a sense around wanting people to live in truth rather than in authenticity. You know, 4 is really all about authenticity. Like, if you're feeling something, if something's going on, you should be able to name it. You should be able to talk about it. That's the healthy thing. And 4s are also about self-expression. You know, so if I see something important that's meaningful, I want to be able to express it. Now, self-preservation 4s tend to put a lid on themselves a little bit more. They tend to keep things more to themselves. They may not have as big of a compulsion to tell the truth, but they can still have a compulsion to tell the truth. And so I think there can be different reasons, but often they're noble. Now, I've had psychotherapy clients who I feel like really, I would say, went through psychological abuse because as children, they were trying to say, this is true, and everyone in the family system completely denied it. You know, it's like this, I'm saying this is black and everyone else is saying it's white, right? And that is a recipe for going crazy. You know, that is a real mind fuck. And I think that happens to fours in families because tends to be a pattern. I've worked with a lot of fours like this. And then again, they become the identified patient or the black sheep of the family or the scapegoat because they were daring to bring up the shadow or the truth that nobody else wanted to see and own. And so in that case, it was like for the person, so the person could be sane. And I think it's what you're saying. It's like they need validation. It's a very real need to know, like, maybe who I am, or that what I'm feeling is authentic or real, or I'm not, you know, making something up. I'm not delusional. So I think there can be a wide range of reasons. And that's why I would say, you know, job one can be, you know, what am I seeing? What's going on for me? What am I trying to get from raising this truth? And, you know, sometimes, let's face it, some fours I think can just be trying to disturb people's shit, right? Because it's like people aren't facing the truth and they want to poke the person, you know, and say, wake up. You know, and again, it can be a noble waking up wish or not so much. But that's why it's good to examine motives. It can be good to say if you have positive intentions and say what your intention is in surfacing the truth. But it can also, I also agree with what Antonia said, like if you're in a family or in a system where people don't want to see the truth and it's about like, I need some validation for my sense of what's real here. It can be really good to go to a therapist, and the therapist can hear you out and give you the validation you want, okay, so it's not you, it's them, you know. Yes, this sounds like it's really true. I hear what your emotions are real. You're on target. You're sensing something or intuiting something that's important. But these people or this person isn't ready to hear it. And you're going to run into resistance because it's not about you.
Joel recommended a book before. It's built with a business context in mind, but I actually thought it was really good for building the skill of having difficult conversations. And that is the book Crucial Conversations. It's a really great book for learning how to approach people. And we are triggering when we bring up the truth, and we'll bring a bunch of our triggering stuff to the conversation. And sometimes the stuff we're bringing into the conversation is so distracting that we can't actually get to the conversation itself. And so it's a way of making, like, putting yourself in like a place of neutrality. And so that you the person of you isn't bringing bringing things into the conversation that will distract from the conversation that needs to be had.
Right. And that's an important point because some fours will want to amp up the drama as a kind of defense, you know, and that's part of the four thing is they can get over dramatic. And so it can be good to sort of be more in a neutral place. There's also a book called Difficult Conversations that I've used in the past.
Yeah. Awesome.
Great.
Thanks for the questions, by the way.
So we're at the 2-hour mark, and I just want to check in. We've got, like I mentioned, we're not going to be able to get to all the questions, but I can grab a couple, like some of them that we've already addressed, the type or the Myers-Briggs type, I might not go into, but if you've got a couple more minutes, maybe we
got a few more minutes. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So some people are actually asking questions about the systems mashing up themselves, which are less targeted, but I thought maybe we could have some of that conversation too, just sort of like a conceptual conversation. An individual asked, where was it? It was, based on Myers-Briggs, similar to the stack developing over time. So with cognitive functions or the car model, you can have, there's a theory that you develop your driver first, and then over time, your co-pilot shows up, and then the 10-year-old, and then the 3-year-old. It doesn't work beautifully like that, but there are some ways to understand sort of the dynamic. They asked, what are the things that show up or become noticeable for the Enneagram type first? Or when do you first start to see their type, and what are the first evidences of it?
So, I mean, I think that type and subtype and instinctual sequence are with us from birth. Now, of course, when we're young, it may not be so clear, and it may vary. Different children may be more sort of obviously show sign of types than others. And of course, we need to let children grow without analyzing this too much. But I'll give an example. I knew my nephew was a self-preservation 9 from the time he was 2 or 3 years old. Like, to me, it was so obvious. And some of the things that he did, self-preservation 9s have a thing of like, if they think you want them to do something, they will not do it. Right. And so he was really funny because, of course, he's a little kid. He's the first grandchild in the family. And people are always wanting to take pictures of him and getting him to smile. And he would go like this. In every picture of him, like until he was like 10 years old, he was like this. He took a really long time to talk. In other words, people are trying, like we want to see the little baby talk. And he was like, the more you want me to talk, the less I'm saying anything. I mean, I just saw that theme in him from so early on. And so I just think that kids are who they are from the beginning. Now, of course, as we grow, our personality unfolds, different capacities come into place. We develop all of us develop different things as we go. So I think if you read the developmental psychological literature about what things develop when, that's probably it. But in terms of type, it's with us from the beginning. And I just think slowly in the behavior of the person and and as you know the person, you can see it. My niece is for sure a 2, and he used to, like, when it was time to go to bed, like my nines like to sleep, right? My 9 nephew would be like, I think I'm going to go to sleep now. Like, it would be his idea, like what kid puts himself to sleep? But my 2 niece, like, it was like there were like a year where it was so hard for her mother to put her to sleep and leave, because she would be, crying, "Mommy, come back, Mommy, come, it's all dark, I'm alone." It was really hard, so you can see these themes, I think, early on in kids, and it's just the way their natural personality unfolds is the way it unfolds.
What's the biggest aha that you've had personally as a result of using both systems together?
Are they asking
you
all
guys
of us?
Want to say that?
Just Beatrice?
Why don't you guys start?
Well, I always start because I'm the know-it-all teacher style. So I always like ask a question and then stop.
Let's have Joel start.
Just in case I'm the person who's always jumping in.
I think for me, weaving in the Enneagram gave me a little bit more perspective on some things I was doing that I thought Myers-Briggs covered me for that were positive, that I realized, oh, maybe I should stop doing these things. Particularly, I think the idea of, the anxiety piece a lot. I think I realized that with weaving Myers-Briggs in, or with weaving Enneagram in on the side of anxiety, I realized how it wasn't really serving me. And I kept unconsciously, I think, in my Enfp personality, was like, well, this is an emotion. This is valid. I can have this. I'm allowed to have this emotion of anxiety because it's motivating me. And I don't think it was until I brought in the Enneagram that I realized this probably is something it's not serving me very well. I need to get a handle on this and find more healthy ways to move through the world. So I think that's the one way, adding in the Enneagram system for me personally. Like, that's the first thing that came to the top of my head. I'm sure I have more as we think about it.
So basically what you're saying is that as an ENFP, because anxiety is an emotion, then your introverted feeling co-pilot, authenticity co-pilot, was like, well, this is an honest emotion for me. So it's what I'm supposed to be doing.
It's authentic for me in the moment. So I feel it. So I'm going to go ahead and use it to get myself to do the things I need to do.
Whereas the more sophisticated view of introverted feeling is not just having an emotion, but actually being able to aikido your emotion.
I would say that's it. I mean, that's the first thing. I'm sure there's more, as I think.
Like fully process it and aikido it, and finding the emotion that not just what's going on for you, but being able to process it and then getting to a more sort of centered place, which anxiety is hard to do. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I would say I'm still working on being bilingual. Like, you guys know the Enneagram better than I know Myers-Briggs, although I'm learning a lot from you, and I'm working on it. But I would say one thing is, it's always nice to speak 2 languages more than one, because if you can bring together, like, for instance, there are certain words in German that there's no English translation for, and so there are certain concepts and certain things that I think people relate to in the Myers-Briggs that have really helped them. you know, that, and so I think if you can bring both of those together, like when I work in business a lot with the Enneagram, there's a lot of people that already know the Myers-Briggs. And so they've already had some insights about themselves, some things that have really helped them to understand. And so if I can bring that together with what I'm teaching with the Enneagram, we can sort of have an expanded range of both what we can talk about and both what they can draw on to understand themselves in different ways. It's almost like having multi-dimensions of which to relate to things to yourself, understand other people, and talk about what's going on.
I just realized another one that's probably even more powerful than that is this idea of authority. It's been my understanding or my impression, my experience with ENFPs that we tend to have a really interesting push-pull relationship with authority where that we, because we make our decisions based on what resonates with us and what's authentic to us, sometimes that can make us feel very insecure. Well, who am I? Maybe I'm not a good person. Maybe I shouldn't rely on my own inner authority.
Right.
And I don't think I really had good language for that as well, because I would always look for external authorities for my introverted feeling, my authenticity, to look at that and go, okay, where's the externalized authority, the quote unquote God in my life? You know, whether it was literally God or something that took the place of a God in my life to help me guide my moral decisions. And I realized that the Enneagram 6 also has a lot of this push-pull nature with authority.
Yeah.
And it was when I started to understand more about the Enneagram, I had more language around this idea of authority. And I realized, oh, okay, I see it's happening in both of my personalities in different ways. And it gave me this ability to kind of look at that and realize that I need to take that authority in on myself and say that I am my own best authority in a lot of these areas of my life that I've been outsourcing to other people.
Yeah.
And I think the Enneagram helped me get a lot of language around inner authority. So I think that was another piece that the crossovers helped with me.
For me, knowing I was a sexual subtype, a sexual 3, was mind blowing. Because as an ENTP, I've always had a compulsion. You know, we're talking about compulsion to tell the truth. Unfortunately, as an ENTP, you can't hide, and you're just constantly saying things all the time that get you in trouble. It's just sort of an ENTP thing. So it took me a while to figure out why I was so willing to sublimate my personal truth in behalf of my family. And when I realized I was a sexual subtype and that those connections, I call them pair bond partners, which my father is a sexual 8, and he and I had a very deep, like, pair bond partner sort of fuse bond, actually is what I call them. You're my pair bond. Fuse bond partners. I get fused to people. And I was so fused to my father in particular, and he's very fused to my mother as a sexual 8, that I was willing to maintain those relationships and that connection. I was willing to completely ignore my own personal truth, my burgeoning, like wouldn't even see it. And so my growth path as an ENTP is to be radically honest and to go inside the programming of my own mind. And I could do it for almost everybody else except for fuse bond partners. And then once I realized I was completely handing my identity over to my fuse bond partners and allowing them to control what I was thinking, man, that just retroactively explains so much of my life, because I couldn't figure out why I couldn't figure out the etymology. Why was I don't do it for anybody. Like, I don't care what society says, you know, I'll give it to the bird. I don't care. But for these few people, they were just able to completely get me to not even acknowledge my personal truth. And now I understand how powerful that is. And so now I have an ability to not overdo my sexual instinct by like overfusing and like going, just tell me what you want me to be. I'll be whatever you want me to be. Right. As a sexual 3. Right. Now I have an ability to like create some boundaries and not just hand myself over to these people, include, you know, these people, and go, okay, well, I get it. I have to maintain my own radical honesty first. And then I check in with the fuse bond partners. So yeah, that was a big one for me. So I think, the word for sexual 9s is fusion. I wonder if the word for most sexual subtypes is fusion. I think fusion is so important.
It's in there.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Okay. And then, let's see. Do you have any strategies or guiding principles for navigating lookalike types between the two systems?
Well, one thing is to use the subtypes, because Oftentimes, if you're trying to decide between two types that look alike, if you look at the subtypes, that it's like, oh, none of these subtypes over here really fit me, but there's one over here that does. Now, another thing is at the end of the complete Enneagram, there's an appendix. And in the appendix, there are there's a differentiating guide for every pair of types. So that is also a resource if you want to look into that. So here's how these two types are alike, and here's how they're different.
Mm-hmm.
I think in general, when you're learning one language, it's hard to learn a second at the same time. But once you learn one language, it can be easier to learn a second language. At least I've been told. I don't know a second language. This is what people tell me in how languages kind of work, right? But sometimes it can be hard to learn two systems at the same time. So I think the general advice that I would give someone is try to get a good handle on your type in one system, maybe first, especially if you're new, if you're just starting out, and then move to the next system before you try to, because what's going to happen is you're going to forget like what you're looking at in yourself in the two systems is going to start to crosswire. So it's almost like master one thing, or not master, but get a sense of it in one area and then add the other area onto it rather than trying to navigate both at the same time. I think that was the biggest advice I would give people.
And I think if you're at the place where you do feel like you have a relative handle on both, enough to be able to diagnose your own type in both systems, but you're really struggling, I think finding, like, I do think it's grounding to know your type in at least one of those two systems. Like, try to nail it down at least in one of them. Yeah. If you're still up in the air about both, like try to choose one in one of those systems as like a point or an anchor point. And that said, if you're really struggling and you keep asking yourself over and over and questioning which subtype you are or which Myers-Briggs type you are, you might be an odd combination. It might be one of the reasons why it's a challenge. Because like we mentioned at the very beginning of the call, we're talking about INTJs and 5s. Like an INTJ and a 5 has so much crossover to it. And if it feels like the stories of those two types are really similar, INTPs would probably fall into this category too. Like the stories are very similar. So if it feels like those stories are just like, yep, that's just me through and through, it's much easier for like an INTJ to go, I'm a 5, than an INTJ to be, or an INTP to be a 2. That's really weird. That's such an odd combination. We have 2 INTP 9s on the call. That's also an unusual combination. Mm-hmm. So if you're an unusual combination, that might be what's going on. And I would start asking yourself, okay, what makes the most sense? Like ENFP 6s are actually rather common. INFJ 1s are rather common. ESFP 7s are common. But an ESFP that's that's a 5 is going to be really, really weird, like really uncommon. That's an unusual combination, but I'm convinced they exist because I've seen pretty much every combination pair up. So that would be the last piece, is that if you can get enough of an anchor in one and then start to look for your type in the other one, and if it's just all wiggity whack, you probably are an unusual pairing, and then build on what you know about what your behaviors actually are. Your story might be kind of nuanced, and like the INTP 9s, right? This idea of like merging with another person. INTPs merge with another person. INTPs are so antisocial according to all the stereotypes, but they really aren't, not if they're 9s, right? So so kind of like knowing that it takes a while. And here's the other piece too. Because the person was really asking about lookalikes, and the challenge with answering that as it's asked is there's a billion of them. There's so many combination of lookalikes once you bring the two systems in, it's crazy. So almost don't worry about that. Just try to get real good at diagnosing and watching your own behaviors.
Right. And sometimes asking other people, because sometimes we don't always know what we're really like. And I think within the Enneagram, sometimes two types can look a lot alike, but there are certain questions that it's either this or this, and so to find those questions, if you can't decide if you're a 3 or an 8 or a 2 or a 9, it's like, okay, 2s do this and 9s do something different. Which one is it?
Mm-hmm, exactly. Yeah. And as a final thought, there's value to thrashing. There's value to it.
Through the process.
For the process of thrashing. Yeah. If it takes you a while to figure out your type, for some people, that's the most introspection they've had their entire lives. And so watching your behaviors and spending a while trying to figure out what it matches up with and really trying to get like that level of self-awareness can be so valuable. So if you've been struggling, or if you see somebody else who's struggling, like it might be good to not have them be saved too soon. Like it might be really good for them to go through the process of really trying to figure out this combination and then finally getting that aha moment where they're like, oh my gosh, this is why this thing is a thing for me. And then there's so much material to work with as a jumping off point for growth because they've been watching themselves for all this time trying to figure it out. So
cool.
Yeah.
So I want to let everybody know before we wrap up that we actually are going to be releasing some live video video that we shot live at a live workshop with Beatrice, where she flew to Los Angeles in the fall of 2019 and did a one-day Enneagram workshop with us. And anyone that was an Enneagram Roadmap student at the time could come and join that event. But maybe you weren't able to join that live, or maybe you just joined the program recently. We're going to make the video recordings of those sessions that Beatrice did during that day available very soon. So watch your inbox for those. We want to give those to you as more bonus, more content to help you grow. In those sessions, Beatrice, again, talks a little bit more about the system in general, but she also talks a little bit more about the spiritual elements of the system and using it for personal growth. So it was a really a great session that Beatrice was a part of, and we really appreciated her coming and being a part of that with us for one day in front of a live studio audience. So you're going to go ahead and get those recordings probably in the next couple of weeks as we get those edited and ready to release. So thank you everybody for being here today. We really appreciate you being on this bonus of the Enneagram Roadmap, where we did a mashup between Myers-Briggs and the Enneagram. Thank you, Beatrice, Dr. Chestnut, for being here with us.
My pleasure.
Great to have you. And we want to keep doing these in the future from time to time with Enneagram Roadmap students. We believe this is a really great format for us to see the crossovers between these two systems and mine out, again, with a focus on personal growth and applying this to your life as an access point to grow yourself. So thank you again. And we'll see everyone on the next session.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, you guys.
No, thank you.